Thank you, Oriana, and thank you, David, for such a warm welcome. It's a personal high for me to be at Central St. Martin's, and thank you all for coming on this Bobby Dazzler of a day on a Friday morning. I know it's hard to go into a space with no windows. So my name is Siân Sutherland. I am a serial entrepreneur, a mum of 2 grown-up boys, and most recently, 7 years ago, I created an organisation with my co-founder, Frederica Magnusson, sitting there, called A Plastic Planet. I love these kind of events because I love the melting pot of all the different insights and perspectives that we get by the different panelists. And the panel that we have together with Nicholas Rochat and Dilys Williams is particularly interesting to me because one is another serial entrepreneur. Nicholas Rochat is disrupting the garment industry, proving that the impossible is possible. And then, of course, Dilys is a professor who is really challenging the creative industry to step up to a different level of responsibility, because never has it been more important for us to have the skill set of the creatives than it is now. So our topic today is going to be this small question, as you say. What a tiny question. What would Earth have us do? So I want to set the scene first with thinking a little bit of our place, planet Earth, in the wider universe. And I don't know if any of you have seen some of these incredible pictures that are coming down from the James Webb telescope that really give us a completely different perspective and imagine us to dream bigger. We are seeing things that we have never been able to see before. The scale of the world, and beyond that, the universe that we live in. We've never seen these things before. And it makes us think, perhaps our boundaries are too small. Perhaps we need to also be thinking bigger. And we've been aware for decades now of the specialness of the planet that we live on, this beautiful green and blue marble that hangs suspended in space that we now know from those images on the James Webb telescope is a completely unique thing. This wonderful globe that we call home. But, and I wanted to set the scene a little bit of why these events that we're at today are so important. That beautiful home is on fire, and we have caused this. And it's shocking to me when you look at only last year. We witnessed 7 extreme weather events. This year, El Niño is coming back in the autumn, and we are forecast to have even more extreme weather events. So I'm not going to dwell too much on a beautiful Friday and be the Debbie Downer of the sessions, but things are happening so much faster than we ever imagined, so we need to speed up. We always talk about the future being something that's a bit unpredictable. It's a bit risky. Who knows what's going to happen? But what we know for sure now is that our future has never been more predictable. More climate devastation. We know that this is the trajectory that we're on. We now talk about resilience rather than prevention. Fewer ecological resources. The impact of temperature has a phenomenal impact on even the way that we grow food. Last year, we grew 25% less crops in Italy alone. Everybody has seen the huge temperatures earlier this year in Spain, the impact simply on olive oil. These things that we think of as luxuries are actually absolute commodities. And we hope that we will have less fossil fuel dependency going forward. And I want to set a little context of why we at A Plastic Planet and Plastic Free are so laser-sharp focused on plastic as the lens to how we can create change. Because I live in a world where often I'm saying, look, Siân, we'll fix the plastic crisis later on. It's all about carbon. It's all about greenhouse gases. That's what we've got to focus on right now. But plastic has given us this incredible opportunity because there are no plastic deniers out there. It's something we feel guilty about every single day. So we see it as a gateway to the climate crisis. It is intrinsically connected to the climate crisis. In fact, in many ways, it has been this visible, physical canary in the coal mine to wake us all up. And when you think about carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, and people say, oh, but it's so light, it's so convenient, it's such an amazing material. It is all of those things. It's also incredibly heavy on greenhouse gas emissions. If it were a country, it would be the 5th biggest emitting country on the planet. And even if it wasn't about pollution, about the devastation, about the fact that every lungful of air that we breathe in now contains plastic, even if it wasn't about any of those things, plastic broke the system. The invention of plastic changed our entire culture of take, make, repair, refill, reuse, rent, share, to take, make, chuck it in a bin for some mythical recycling fairy to do something with that now we know nothing is actually happening with it. So it created this opportunity for us to change our system and ramp up to these giddy levels of hyperconsumption. We've had plastic for so long, it's really easy for us to think that it's material in itself. Plastic is a mixture of chemicals. Many of them are toxic. One of the things that we've been working on recently is the creation of the Plastic Health Council, bringing the science, the proof, the irrefutable proof of the impact of the plastic chemicals to all the major governmental and United Nations events. It is not like copper and aluminium or cobalt. It is simply a mix of chemicals. 13,000 chemicals are used to make plastic. 50% of them have never been tested for the impact on human health. And much as we talk now about circularity, and I'm sure many of the courses here focus on circularity, plastic will never fit into any kind of circular model. You don't recycle plastic, you downcycle plastic. And I know a lot of you will have seen this little illustration before, which I put up simply to show, can anybody tell me what is wrong with the circular economy in this visual that everybody uses and everybody refers to?
Still got plastic.
What's wrong with the final one?
The bin.
There's still a bin. There's still a bin. That is not circularity. And the reason for that, and anyone here who works in the wider world of materiality, the reason for that is we take materials from nature, we take resources from nature, and then we chemically modify them. Even something as natural as leather, skin, designed by nature to go back to become the nutrient for the next stage of growth. And what do we do to it? We tan it, use chromium, heavy dyes, toxic chemicals, so that it cannot go back to nature as a nutrient. So I want to give you a provocation that imagine if we rethought materials, and instead of chemically modifying them so that they could never go back to nature as a nutrient, that instead we didn't chemically modify them, that we take from nature, we borrow them, we simply borrow them, but we keep their nutrient status so that when they eventually return to nature, which everything always does, they go back as a nutrient for the next stage of growth. And it's doable. We work in the world of materials at Plastic Free, and it's so exciting to me to see the amount of innovation that is happening in this space, particularly around nutrient-based materials. And then the other thing that we have to be careful of course, is we need to take less. Earth Overshoot Day, in the US, Earth Overshoot Day is actually the 12th of March. So this year, on the 12th of March, the US had taken the amount of material they were entitled to, that nature could replace. So Earth Overshoot Day is something that we need to be aware of. We are literally taking the resources from our children's future. We're making stuff with them. We're selling it and calling it GDP. So this fundamentally has to change. It is not about swapping one material for a slightly less bad material. It's less in the first place. Because one of the provocations I want to give you is this. I had a call the other day from a journalist saying, the government, I don't know if you've heard, the government are thinking of having 7 bins in your kitchen. What do you think? Who can afford to have 7 bins? Don't you think there's a cost of living crisis? What's your opinion? And I said, well, my opinion, to be honest, is why is there 1 bin? Why is there any bin? Why have we normalized waste? We are the only species on the planet that creates waste. So that's the fundamental question that we need to answer. So we like to think of the plastic crisis in a slightly different way, as perhaps a gift, that little tap on the shoulder. So the whole of humanity, we are all impacted by plastic, to say, hey, you've gone down a toxic cul-de-sac and you need to get out of it fast. So for us, we consider it this fossil fuel awakening to not only get us to think differently about materials, but also the systems of how we live. carbon, I don't know, I can't see it, can't feel it, I can't touch it. Plastic, I feel guilty about every single day. But technology has really failed us here. And I was on a plane the other day, don't judge me, I was on a plane the other day, and it struck me, nothing's changed. Like the plane experience is the same as it was 50 years ago. The car experience, yes, we might have EVs now, but other than that, fundamentally it's the same. So it struck me that technology has actually failed us. It's so much about this little thing I hold in my hand, how it can sell me more stuff. That's where technology has focused. And what we need technology for now is to really get us to think in a much bigger, more exciting way. We haven't even bothered to replace plastic as material. We haven't bothered to invent new materials. Imagine the materials of the future that we're now going to invent in a post-plastic world. We believe passionately that creatives are the answer for this, which is why it's so exciting for us to be here with you all. But I think creatives are going to need new tools. They are not trained for this new world, this post-plastic world, where we have different systems, where we have different materials, where we think about circularity in a different way. So for the last 2 years, we have designed and built a new design tool for the creative industry, built by creatives for creatives, to help them think in a completely different way, to help them feel like the smartest person in the room, to push back against that inevitable creative brief that just says, use a recycled polymer, use a bioplastic. It'll be enough, that'll give us a green tick. I'm going to show you a tiny little 60-second film that shows you what this looks like. And you'll not be surprised that as an entrepreneur, I believe equally passionately that business is the tool of change. We can't wait for governments. They're never going to regulate us in time. They will do what industry wants. So industry need to step up and they will be the tool of change. But I have never, if I look back through the big social changes in history, have they ever been instigated, catalyzed by an economist or a banker? No. It has always been the creatives. It has always been the maverick thinkers, the architects, the engineers who have pulled humanity from one system to a better system, and that's what we need right now. Always it has been this way. So we believe that design has the power to change everything, because everything is designed, even if it's a bad design. It's had an element of a creative process at the beginning. Everything we wear, the cities we live in, everything in our world is designed. So this is their moment. And we need to stop thinking that the future, it's inevitable. It's just going to happen. I read all these articles about artificial intelligence and oh, it's so terrifying. Say, you think we've got no control over this? What is wrong with us? The future doesn't just happen. It is created by us, and we need to think about it differently. But we need to do it fast. And there's too much think tanking, there's too much McKinsey, huge reports on the desks of the CEOs, there's not nearly enough action tanks. So we need to go faster. And everybody in this room, everybody watching this, you are the ones with the power. There is this wrecking ball of change that is happening right now. The future is not some distant thing in 2030. It is happening right now, today, at breakneck speed. And you all need to be part of it. We need your skills like never before. Because hope is not a theory. It is not, for me, even a noun. It's something you do every single day, something you create every single day. And one thing as an entrepreneur, because you learn very quickly how to fail, is you have to have hope, you have to have optimism. So I'm going to leave you now with this final question as I hand over to Nicholas Rochat. Because the real question for me is not about what's the most sustainable thing, what's the new material, what's the slight twist on the dial of the status quo. The real question for me is this: how are we going to live? Because we are going to have to live in a very, very different way in the very near future. So it gives me great pleasure to now introduce my friend and colleague and an amazing entrepreneur who is disrupting the garment industry, Nicholas Rochat from Mover.
Thank you, Siân. Thank you, Siân. Well, what shall I say after that? Thank you for inviting me here. It's an honor to be in the mecca of design and fashion. We are Mover Plastic-Free Sportswear. We are a small Swiss independent company. Swiss people like to be small and independent. I'd like to speak today about the relation between sports and nature with regards to our background in technical sporting garments and our passion for the outdoors. The planet first. These small animals are copepods. You may know these. They are 5 gigatons of this less than 1 millimeter size zooplankton living in our world's oceans. Every night they migrate from 200 meters below the sea surface to the surface to eat on zooplankton and on phytoplankton, sorry. And by doing that, they move more water than the moon and the tides. It's the biggest mass migration on the world. But not just that. They eat 30 times the carbon that humanity can produce by burning fossil fuels. The same humanity has wiped out 50% of these animals in the last, of the marine planktons in the last 70 years. So there's very direct impacts to what we do. How did they wipe them out? Through chemicals and through plastic pollution. So ocean plastic pollution, the plastics we see floating on the oceans, whiling in the gyres or washed up on the beaches, these, sorry for that, these plastics only account for 8% of the total plastic pollution, ocean pollution. These are the ones killing the birds, the turtles, and the whales. It's just 8%. All the rest, 92%, is a soup of microplastics. And out of that soup, a big third comes from our textiles, synthetic textiles. And this is what we can address. And so because the impact we can have just by changing our clothing habits is significant. It is a third of the actual ocean problem. For some strange reason, almost all sportswear is made of plastic since the last 50 years. And when we say for no real reason, is that we, as sport people, we don't really understand why we never questioned that before. Is Usain Bolt 7% faster than Jesse Owens was in 1936, thanks to his plastic shirt? Certainly not. It would actually be very interesting to see these both guys run today on the same clay track and starting without starting blocks and see which one would win today. So it's this progress. And then, of course, the industry answer to, and the regulators answer to, well, the industry, sorry, answers to the plastic problem is to rely on profitable science and to work on plant-based plastic, on algae-based plastic, on corn-based plastic, on whatever biopolymers or PLA, recycled plastics, all these materials that will never degrade as long as they're in contact with oxygen. And by chance, we still have oxygen in the ocean and on our outdoors. It's a very cynical answer from the industry. This is a label of a pair of shoes I bought last year to go in the mountain. And it's written here that it's the upper fabric is made of 50% or more of recycled content, while the sole has at least one material in the midsole. Outsole contains a minimum of 3% bio-based or 5% recycled content. Wow, that's stunning. It's really, this is New Balance, yeah. It's really amazing. And to ask the question is, shall we transform a toxic linear economy? We know it is toxic into a toxic circular economy. This is your bin. But it's a nonsense when you think of why would we put something that we have taken out of the nature, which is toxic, back into the environment. And we say, ask the fish what this one thinks about recycled plastic. This fish has eaten 9% of recycled plastic. 9% is, in green here, the number of, recycled plastic today, worldwide. In 40 years from now, this will double to 17%, 18%. Meanwhile, the plastic production will triple, exceeding 1.2 billion tons of plastic per year. And this is the result of our recycling plastic policy. It is to allow the industry to continue the business. We are sounding the alarm. We are a very small company, but we decided to go completely plastic-free 3 years ago. And we launched this project in October 2021. And we decided to use no PLA, no bioplastic, no compostable plastic, no elastane, no lyocell, no spandex, nothing, no lies at all. And we just had to rethink and reinvent everything to create new garments, but nothing that much new neither, because basically it is a cotton sweater and a wool short. What is very interesting is to understand how far we can go in the process and what we can make out of it and how we feel wearing this instead of what we have been wearing in the last 50 years. So we worked on the trims, on the accessories, on the details. Our threads are cotton. We struggled with the zippers, not with the zippers because the teeth and the slider and the puller are made of metal, but with the tape, the band it is fixed on, because it's only made on polyester today, or a mixed polyester cotton. The small cord stoppers or, of course, buttons is easy, but we had to reimagine a lot of small things. This is a little extract of the latest collection. What is beautiful is to work with our suppliers on the actual structures of the fabrics, because what is available can be enhanced, can be improved, and that's what is very interesting in the process we are in today. And amazingly, as a result, it all gets much more comfortable. And there's a reason for that, and that was our starting point. It was a search for breathability, because we used to do technical ski clothing with Gore-Tex and polyamide, and our frustration was the breathability, the thermal exchange of the system. And that's how we came actually, not through a sustainable angle, but through a functional angle to this new approach and new concept. So we are a very small team in Lausanne, dedicated, passionate by outdoors and very attentive to details. we are ready to move now to the next level. Our project is ready to go. We sell online. We have a logistic base in Spain. We produce mostly in Portugal. Obviously, we rethought also the packaging, the tool to ship, the flow with our suppliers and manufacturers. We were lucky enough to be able to rethink everything from scratch. And now we are at a point that we have to communicate, to reach out, to gain traction, to move faster, and to sell less garments, possibly, to more people. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm passing the word to you.
Thanks, we're going to do Q&A.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks, Nicholas. I love that phrase, feel plastic-free, because you're right, when you wear a natural material, it does feel completely different, that breathability, and it's a great expression. So, without further ado, I am passing the mic on to Dilys Williams to talk to you about this new level of responsibility for designers.
Thank you very much, Siân. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Great to see you today, and thank you for 2 amazing presentations. So, let me move this on. Just a very few words there, but within those few words lies a really profound repurposing of what it means to be a designer. Because within those few words, it tells us that the earth is our sole beneficiary, our benefactor, our participant, and our only source of life. In the words of Ruskin, wealth is the only source of life is the only source of wealth. And what we've just heard just now about plastic is really incredibly important. But is that enough? And what actually does it mean to be a designer in the context of our times? It requires a really deep shift in our collective habits of mind, our sources of knowledge, our frames of reference, and our sense of ourselves in relation to the wider world of which we are a part. Our intuition, our ingenuity, our resources of human intelligence are actually all part of the earth too. So, are we hoping for the impossible? David Graeber's work is a great inspiration to me, and I have amazing evidence through my own work as a designer, through working with students, with designers in small businesses, through to people who work in massive global industry businesses, with researchers, with tutors, and there is amazing evidence that we can think differently. There is evidence that fashion actually is an activity that takes place at personal, intimate levels through to the pervasive global level, which means that it can help us to think about how we make things. It can help us to think about our social relationships and notions of value. And importantly, fashion creates a zeitgeist and a sense of actually what's important to us in a very visible form. And that zeitgeist can have a really profound impact, not just on what we make, but why we make it, how we make it, with whom we make it, and how we think about each other and identify ourselves in the world. So we've heard a little bit from Siân already that this making of the world in the way that we've done it based on a model of extractivism and exploitation has created an extreme act of self-harm. We're talking here not just about the stability of Earth systems, we need to talk about Earth systems justice, about a safe place in which there's a global commons for all people now and into the future. And that means more than just changing the parts of what we're doing. And again, as already been said, making society has involved already exceeding at least 7 of globally quantified safe and just boundaries out of 9. From the work of Rochat back in 2009, we've had a very clear idea of these boundaries already for a long time, before even thinking back to Silent Spring, 1950s, etc. But I mean, World Economic Forum is not well known for its ecological thinking, but in this simple diagram here, which is from the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, you can see the interdependencies of life systems and justice. The way that we live, every element of society and how we see ourselves in the world is intertwined with climate change, biodiversity loss, and social injustice. Just one particular stat, $44 trillion worth of society is exposed through biodiversity loss. And if we're thinking about the intersectional impacts of all of this, which are basically written across the bottom of there, the situation is stark. But the good news is, it's our ways of living, our perceptions of prosperity that is actually at the heart of the problem. We can change that. Artists and designers make sense of things. We are here to create conditions for changing not just what is, but how reality is looked at and how we interpret things. We can tear down the borders of current understandings. We can explore with each other through making what it means to live well together. This is an image from, I came into academia from working as a designer. I was head of women's wear at Catherine Hamnet for a long time. And that's where I first started to realize actually how differently we could behave through acts of fashion. And fashion must, as Nicholas was saying, reduce its emissions by between 50 to 60%. And that's just emissions if we are to keep within Earth system boundaries. 50 to 60% reduction in the quantity is arresting. It's an amazing figure. We also need to be really careful. There's a lot we need to be careful about. But averages are misleading. It's the richest 20% of people who have 20 times the emissions of the poorest 20%. So that tells us who needs to do what and how. So I've worked with a lot of other people thinking about what it means to be a designer and have practice in fashion and to make sense of things. But I have to say, the more that we do this work, the more we realize just how difficult it is. The more we realize that thinking otherwise to this dominant system is something that is a very inconvenient truth for a lot of people who are in the current system. Because regeneration, reparation, and other elements of Earth systems justice involves much more than improving efficiencies. It means much more than innovations in a current system. It means intergenerational justice, intragenerational justice between countries, communities, and interspecies justice as well. So how can we as designers take this on? In the words of Gregory Bateson, we have an epistemological error, an error in our ways of knowing, our habits of mind, in many but not all parts of the world. We're torn between our current thinking that's based on a logic of volume and an ecological thinking that actually goes to the heart of what's important. And I also draw on Guattari's work around the three ecologies. And this also, I think, is where fashion is incredibly important. Because if we're thinking about the crisis at personal, societal, and biosphere level, and we think of ourselves as on a personal, societal, and biosphere level, because we are all working and operating and living at all of these levels simultaneously, then fashion is an important way to be able to recognize and act on the situation. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the examples of how I've been working with others over the last few years and kind of where I've got to, because there's never a static point. But I've been looking at this idea of what it means to be a designer, coming from working as a designer in industry, this idea of creating boundary objects, creating a collection. There's all sorts of things that you can do around being a designer in that context, but it's not enough in itself. There's a lot of work around thinking about designers as co-inquirers, how we work with others, and how we can co-learn with each other, from each other, as a set of people with a shared intention. But what I think maybe I've been particularly interested in is this idea of the creator of learning objects, where the designer creates or creates the conditions where others can do the creating, or sets out ways in which to be able to invite people. The designer is host. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. So when you're a designer, as a boundary object designer, you have a collection, you have things that you're asked to make, and there's only certain, but you can make lots of changes within those things. When you're thinking about a co-inquirer, it's about how you use participatory practice, how you use principles of transformation design to co-inquire with each other about the opportunities and barriers in bringing together ideas from the concept through to, here is an example of a concept that I use called shared talent, which I did in a lot of different ways, in which we reconvened using a transformative scenarios planning methodology, reconvened people across the system that don't normally get to meet each other or to understand the interdependencies, the cause and effect between their decisions. And that was one of the outcomes from one of the first projects. And then designer as host, where this is an example of a project that I've run in a number of different places, where you look at the conditions in a context and you think about the concerns that people may have, and you invite people in to talk about those concerns, either through making or through representing themselves, through photography, etc. This is something that we did in Crisp Street, looking, because it's a particular area of London where there's a lot of biodiversity loss. This is an example where we did some work in the House of Lords. We took in irons and sewing machines, and we started to make things so that we could represent the concerns of different people in relation to their lives and across different age ranges as well. So in 2008, I used some of those concepts to set up Centre for Sustainable Fashion and to really set out a set of ways in which we could approach thinking about what it means to be a designer. Over time and through learning with and from and as designing what it means to contextualize our work, we've created a kind of methodology that, when I get as far as being able to do good tech, I'll be able to make this into a 3D model. So the methodology is based on this idea that there are ways of being able to see the world in social, cultural, economic, and ecological lenses, and ways in which you can create prosperity across those 4 lenses. There are ways of recognizing and understanding ourselves in the world using different kind of philosophies and belief systems. Thich Nhat Hanh's into being philosophy of how we can understand ourselves as part of the other. Ubuntu, this idea of I am because you are. There's lots of ways in which we have developed this model to be ways of seeing, knowing, and doing that take us beyond the fashion, the canon of fashion in its conventional form. And how do we know whether we're making any difference through our work? We've looked at transformation design, and I've taken a very simplistic way of thinking about ideas of working within a context and designing within a context, which is what the boundary object maker often does, or awareness raising does, which is really, really important, but not enough in itself. Then there's the ideation level, where we're actually thinking about the boundaries and the borders of the context in which we're in, and creating services and systems in which we can change the ways in which we interact with products. But the deep shift is something that we need to be able to find ourselves in so that we understand ourselves differently. But this deep shift is really, really difficult and very uncomfortable. It's very difficult and uncomfortable because there's so much holding on to the old systems, with very good reason. All of our lives are tied up in a consumerist capitalist model that's based on volume. And for us to be able to move beyond that is very scary for a lot of people who've invested a lot of time and a lot of money and their sense of selves in this. So I've found that it's been really useful for me to draw upon Camus' work and looking at rebellion and the rebel, and to think about how we can simultaneously amplify and expand and enhance the things that we know to be progressive, to be something that is towards Earth systems justice, to be able to really work together, to be able to look at ways in which we can communicate and, in the words of Donnella Haraway, tell the stories of meaning through the way in which we are presenting ourselves. But unless we simultaneously negate and phase out the stuff that we can no longer stand and no longer sit around and be complicit in, then we will not actually be able to create a difference. Through 15 years of my work here at the university, I'm really excited and proud of all the things that I've been be involved in with lots of other people. However, in the grand scheme of things, we see that it has not dented this model of volume. As even all of the new ways in which we're thinking about fashion as resale, etc., it has not actually reduced the volume in which people are consuming. In fact, it's exacerbating it. People are doing things for all good intention, but unless we fundamentally shift our ways of seeing, knowing, and being, we're not going to be able to actually create the deep change we need. So sitting and holding that space, that intention lightly, is a really difficult but a very important place for designers to be, because we do negotiate, we do use making to be able to make sense of things. And as a university, it's an incredible role for us right now, especially as we're becoming very committed to being a social purpose university. Sitting in that tension, holding that intention, and being able to understand that we can't take a dualistic approach. The people who have different risks at different levels, for me, I work with designers or students that are really rethinking things from the start of their practice, through to people who are working in massive design companies. And the risks are different in different places. The intentions might be the same, but the risks of losing your job, who can afford to be critical when we are in a business that has given us particular demands, particular targets. So we have to think about how we can work with intention across all of those scales, and think about how we can hold it lightly, but with complete conviction. Because unless we do that, we will not be true to ourselves as designers. So just to finish off, and I'm hoping I've got another minute, transforming fashion means that we've got to look at the realities of living in the Anthropocene and repurposing fashion's activities at multiple scales across regions, and transforming the why as well as the how, the what, and the with whom of our practice. It's well underway, but we haven't reached the tipping point yet, and it does take all of us to be able to come into this in different ways, and the multiplicity of answers that we can create. The fourfold prosperity model that I talked about earlier on does involve it producing far less clothing, shifting to regenerative agriculture, relocalizing supply chains, reparation for the opportunity lost for those who are in the system that we created through that model and will no longer necessarily have jobs in that. I spoke to people in very big businesses who recognize their responsibility. Businesses have a responsibility as we make this transition. Governments have a responsibility, and we as individuals have a responsibility to think about actually what reparation means. And it's huge, and it's difficult, but we have to do it. So biosphere rebellion involves amplification of fashion as a cultural expression. It's why I became a designer. It's what I love about fashion. The ingenuity to be able to make this viable, we need livelihoods in it. But in Earth systems justice terms, it must be the negation of the commodification of design and designing through this stimulation and volume model. Earth systems justice involves drawing on a broader canon of knowledge, the unwritten, the tacit, the indigenous, the situated, the eco-feminist, towards a justice that is in gender, race, class, geography, and environmental terms, as because all of these things are absolutely intertwined in our interbeing. It also means repurposing education. And that's what I'm also very excited about, and I could speak all day about. So through this, designing can be seen as individual and collective acts, as professionals, as citizens, but all around fundamentally questioning, disrupting, and reassembling the methods of design of our clothing and our production and consumption. But more importantly, the understanding of the ecologies within which they sit. Thank you.
I know we're running a little behind, and we're going to do a very, very brief Q&A. Thank you so much, Dilys. I'm so glad this is being filmed, because I want to watch that entire presentation from you again. It was so inspiring and so deep there was so much in there. I thought that was incredible. I love the 3 ecologies, all of those things. So we're going to do a very brief Q&A, and if anybody has a burning question, it's only coffee out there. It's not going to go cold. But I would love to just have the opportunity for you to ask any questions of these amazing panelists. I will kick off with a question for Nicholas, because as we all know, we live in a world of greenwash. And particularly, I think, brands and I think the fashion industry is very guilty of greenwash. And I look at things like Patagonia and Nike and the sustainability claims that they're making. Even Patagonia that we put on this pedestal. Oh, it's so amazing. Look what he's saying now. Nature's our only stakeholder, having made billions, let's say. What's your thoughts on that? Is it something that you strive against?
Well, first, you mentioned the target 226 in your chart, and I think that's a realistic target. In Davos at the WEF Forum last year, H&M was on stage, and they proudly announced that they had 8% of recycled plastic in their collection, and that they would reach 20% by 2030.
Woo!
Come on. But they were on stage, and they were applauded for that. So there's a real greenwashing issue, a real problem with the industry. It is good for business. It's not business for good, for sure. We have this, Adidas Parley for the Ocean shoes, where they recycle the fish nets from the oceans to produce a shoe together with a foundation. They did 50 million shoes, pairs of shoes. If Parley gets 1% royalty, maybe it's 20 million revenue for the foundation. Does this money go back to the ocean? For sure, the shoes will go back to the ocean.
Yeah.
And Patagonia, I'm sorry, because it's my hero. I was grown up with Patagonia. I was driving to Chamonix to get my first fleece jacket. So I love the brand. I love Yvan Chouinard, everything he did. And today, the CEO pretends he doesn't know what his marketing team is doing when he's addressed about the recycled polyester in their garments. So this is a lie. So I'm sorry, but I'm very activated against recycled plastic, as you can see, because I really believe it is a big danger. I take it as a fraud. Mm-hmm. I take it as a fraud, and it should be fined and condemned, because in other industries, it would not be allowed. It could be considered as an ecocide.
Yeah, I completely
I'm
agree.
angry.
Yeah, good, come on, that's what we need. Dilys, I loved your whole thing about co-solving. And as an entrepreneur, I'm always conscious of that sometimes these two worlds of business and creativity are very separate, and never have they needed to be together more. And I know that perhaps within UAL, there is a bit more cohesion. Are you hopeful that these two communities can actually collaborate together? Because certainly economic models need massive reinvention. Donut economics and Kate Raworth, I'm a massive fan of her. But how can we get the creative industry to disrupt the business industry even more?
Yeah, you've got a great point. I think that it's that recognition of risk as well, though, because the people who have been working in a context where they've built up an economic model that needs to be torn down, but we need to be able to work out how we can tear it down, because at the moment it's being grasped onto tighter than ever. We see it in politics, we see it in business, and we've got to be really careful not to have this dualistic approach or the sort of finger-pointing approach. And I do think that that's where creatives are really good at being able to go in, and the act of making actually is a great way of people being able to get beyond their job roles. I mean, the shared talent model that I showed up there is an example of sort of immersive practice where you can bring people in from lots of different fields of life, from economists to buyers in business to CEOs, alongside embroiderers, etc. And actually the act of making and the conversations and the creation, it kind of breaks down the silos. The transformative scenario planning modeling that I've used as well is a way of convening people in deep immersion, and I found that to be really, really helpful. I mean, people have got to be willing to be able to let go even just for a few hours or for a few days to be able to immerse. And situated practice is another example where you start to actually understand things beyond the surface. And I think we've got to try to find ways, certainly as designers, we're well positioned to be able to find ways in which to convene situations where people can use practice to really kind of get to the heart of things, and the heart of the things that they're fearful about, the concerns they have, because people hold on to things because they're not sure what will happen otherwise. And we have got to learn to let go.
Yeah.
And that's not easy as a designer either.
And step into that unknown, because for sure the current systems have failed us. I read a terrifying stat the other day, which was we have enough clothing on the planet already to clothe 6 future generations, which makes you think. Has anybody here got a question for us? Yes, oh great, loads of questions. You have until 11:50. Oh, we've got loads of time. Why did I think we were rushing? Oh my God, great, we've got all the questions. And coffee isn't even brewed. Should we start over here?
I'm sorry,
Dilys. Dilys.
The microphone.
I think my question is for you. I left education, where I was a teacher for 46 years in schools and higher education, last year. And my focus was very much on environmental education. I think education is really, really important. But my question is, I joined UAL in September as a student on the MA in Fine Art. My question really is, how is UAL, and this is not just for you, it's for anyone who works in UAL, how are you educating your students and your tutors? Because my experience on the MA in Fine Art is that we have many machines for making things, stuff from plastic. Materials like resin are used very frequently. Other kinds of materials which I think are not sustainable, like, for example, acrylic paint, which then goes down the sink, are used on a daily basis. There aren't, presumably in the world, that many fine artists compared with fashionistas. But nevertheless, I think it's important that we look in the university about what we encourage, which materials we encourage our students to make. And the second aspect of this is the idea of alternatives. You've talked about social justice and climate change justice. We cannot turn to the natural world or natural materials and think that we're going to find the solution here, because any use of leather or silk or wool involves cruelty. And you've talked about interspecies justice, and you've talked about intersectionality, and we have to look at all of the materials that we use. We cannot say, well, we're not going to use plastic, we're going to turn to use natural materials. So my question, first of all, really is about, how are you educating the students and the tutors about the actual materials that are used and encouraged to be used on your courses? So sorry, it's a long question. Sorry.
Yeah, no, great, thank you. And obviously I can only speak from my role as Director of the Centre for Fashion, but also my role as chair in the social purpose group. And yeah, it is complex. I mean, the answer I can give you, because maybe I'm happy to catch up afterwards as well. But look, we've got 4 ways in which across the university we're considering how we can transform the system of what, why, how, and with whom we educate to what end. And those 4 elements are through looking at curriculum change, staff development, student experience, and looking at all the the touch points of students and along their journey, and we identified very particularly actually the need to also support staff, because staff are very busy and maybe don't even necessarily have the time to be able to develop their own practice and evolve that as well in relation to environmental and social justice. So that's one area. A second area is in operations and materials. And yes, as you say, it's huge. And we do sit on this balance. We do have to hold the tension between being able to change the processes and the practices and also prepare people for when they go into industry and what industry is currently doing and what industry needs to change, even the elements that it doesn't necessarily know it needs to change yet or is not ready to change. So we do sit in that tension, and things can't change overnight, but there is a commitment. There's a climate action plan that was made public last year. And the other two areas are through mobilizing communities. And Kate Pelham's here today, I know. And that is a really important way in which our communities are looking at their practice and demonstrating and sharing with each other how their practice can change. And the fourth one is looking at research and knowledge exchange and the infrastructure around what it means to be a social purpose university. So there is work going on. We've made it public. We report on it every year. But there's a long way to go, obviously. But the specifics of materials as well, in particular courses, it's really important that the courses themselves make the decisions, because there isn't a blanket kind of like, okay, let's stop this and let's start that. As you say, there's the cause and effect of different decisions that we make. So it's really important to be able to talk about it openly, and the things that we haven't been able to do yet, and why, and how we can move quicker. I mean, I think the most important thing to focus on, and that's why I'm really interested in the rebel kind of analogy, is what do we actually dial down, and how can we dial down things and simultaneously really amplify the things that we can do well. So that tension between what we can do more of and what we absolutely need to do less of is something that I think everybody has to kind of take part in.
Yeah. May I add that I think it's the rebel. I think is brilliant because it's a matter of mindset, and I think it's about creating the right environment for this mindset to happen. It takes time to enter your pores, but once you get there, I guess both Siân and myself, we get allergic to plastic. So it's not anymore something we have to think about. We just don't want it no more.
Yeah.
So it takes time. It will take time, and these sessions are so useful for that.
And I just want to add one more thing to, you bring up acrylic paint and things like that, and it's so interesting to me how plastic is so invisible to us. So yes, we're aware of it in textiles. 70% of all our clothing globally now is made out of plastic. We're aware of it there. We see it with packaging, of course. But it's the fact that as soon as you paint anything, a building, a wind turbine, anything, you've made that a plastic building. You made that a plastic structure. Nobody thinks about that. And the second biggest user of plastic globally is the built environment. But what is exciting for us when you refer to things like, animal cruelty and raping nature of more and animals, and the injustice of that we also need to address when we transition from this fossil fuel material, most subsidized material in the world, to better things. The exciting thing for me is seeing these new materials that are coming up. And when I talk about that new circle, nature's original circle of nutrient growth, that there are a new generation of materials that are happening very quickly. And we need students and academics to really embrace this new world of materiality, which are nutrient, not just plastic-free, but toxin-free. Our world is unbelievably laced, infected with chemicals now. We make a new chemical every 10 minutes. And we have no idea the impact that these chemicals that we just release into the environment is having. But these nutrient materials that are not using animal byproducts, that are based on natural rubber and gum and cellulosic fibers. I mean, massive opportunity of cellulosic fibers, not just trees, everything else. But the materials and the composites that we're seeing, and there's a company that Nicholas and I work with closely called Natural Fiber Welding, phenomenal business. They've reinvented the entire system of how we take and make. And everything can be locally sourced. It's extraordinary combinations. The founder won Inventor of the Year in the US last year. His plant leather alternative is the only plastic-free plant leather alternative out there available at scale. Every BMW car interior is going to be using that material. You could eat it. That's how toxic-free it is. He's collaborated on a trainer, which has just come out. We mentioned Adidas. The ex-creative director of Adidas had to leave because he just couldn't be part of the bullshit anymore, that ocean plastic is the answer, because it's nothing but a marketing scam, to be honest. And he set up a company called Unless Collective. He's collaborated with NFW, and they have created the world's first nutrient sneaker that you can literally just grind up and put it back to the planet as a nutrient. So those kind of materials, and that's just one company, there are many others using algae and plant proteins. We now have to think materials have to be so good for nature that we could eat them. And if they're not, we should question why. So I think there is hope, and we must stop thinking that transition means that we can just soft pedal and keep using plastic, and maybe we use recycled plastic because that makes us feel a bit better, it's less bad. We have to really accelerate towards this very, very different world. And I think David Attenborough famously said, we have all the answers. What we have now is a communications problem, which is why, again, for me, the creative industry is so important, because we need to communicate sustainability and the aspiration of this reinvention of a new aesthetic of what is beauty. We have to do that very quickly as well. For me, sustainability is not about less. It's not about something slightly green and hairy. It's about beauty. It's about abundance. And so we've got to reframe this shift that is not about negative, that is massively about positive, so that then we can rush towards it.
How does this work in relation to ideas of survival in the global south? Because this feels like a very particular kind of northern hemispheric kind of new form of coloniality that is kind of encouraging us to think differently. When most of the world is living within a kind of complete, unrelated kind of example of what it is that you're offering us as a solution.
Yep. I can't.
So I'm deeply concerned with this kind of paradigm that we're offering, because it doesn't feel to be kind of connected.
There is a panel after lunch that I highly encourage you to join. It's Nell's panel with Jennie Stevenson, and when she talks about climate and where we need to get to, she frames everything around climate justice. And so everything that you've just said, I absolutely concur with. I mean, the global south make for the rich north to consume. And what do? We send our rubbish, our waste, back in return. We take all the resources from the global south. The inequality there's not enough words to cover the inequality of what has happened and what continues to happen every single day. The UK alone, we export 60% of our plastic waste, largely to developing countries, expecting them to deal with it. But I think that there is an opportunity for us, through the lens of climate justice, to address so much of the concerns that you raise there. I don't know if you guys want to add anything.
No, I see it almost as the opposite, because to me it is common sense to go back to natural fibers and to forget what we have tried for the last 50 years and to reconnect with actually what the planet and the Earth is giving us. So I love the research and the technology and the new materials as much as I love natural fibers, and I feel good touching them. The entire world has been wearing natural fibers for millenniaries, and it worked perfectly fine. So to me, yes, we have created a huge distance and a huge gap between two worlds, but to me, these solutions are a way to reconnect also both together. So I see it more as something prospective and positive.
You continue.
Hello. Thank you. Alvaro here from not far from Patagonia, from the end of Chile. I have just one question. I've seen the Patagonia and the beauty and the impact, and also I've seen the desert in the north, where the biggest fashion waste has been displayed in the middle of the small desert that we have in Chile. Mountains and hills full of Armani, Benetton, and we don't know what to do with. So in base of that, my question is, what is the role of researchers and designers and not the trend? I've been working with refugee camps in a huge project with Silvia Grimaldi, Lara Salina, Adam Thorpe for SADC, 3 billion pounds toward net zero 2030 and 2050. And, you know, for my surprise, one of the biggest surprise is a lack of reality that authorities and designers have. Been working not long ago in Spain, in Bilbao, with homeless. And one of them, a Dutch rough sleeper, said, you know what is the problem, guys? You, researchers, should be homeless for a week or two, and then you will have a full knowledge of what it means and how to address. So, back to the question, how do you see the role of researchers and designers and not the trend in order to tackle net zero 2030, 50, and so on and forth? Apparently, there is a dichotomy in between what we practice and what we produce or what we influence seems to be for the West. But what about the minorities? What about the refugee camps? What about the Aboriginal communities? So where can we bridge that in a more holistic, real connection? So what is the role and not the trend?
I'm happy to take that. Thank you. I couldn't hear all of what you were asking, but I certainly heard quite a bit of it. And I think that it's a really tricky thing for us to work as designers in the UK in a very privileged context, and as you say, in a very comfortable context. Even if you try to consider what it means to be in a very vulnerable position, we're not necessarily ourselves there. I mean, we do quite a bit of work around what it means to be a participant, this idea of co-inquiry. One of the researchers in Centre of Sustainable Fashion spends quite a bit of time in refugee camps looking at what it means, how it changes the role of the designer, and those three sort of kind of that heuristic model of the different ways in which we can think about ourselves. I mean, it's not a fixed kind of like, here are the three ways in which you can be a designer, but it's helped me as somebody who came from industry, who was somebody who was expected to create collections and work in a very conventional way, to think about how can I use the capabilities that I've developed both through my education and through my practice in very different ways to be able to situate learning and exploration in ways that can help people to connect together and understand each other's context. You know, how can I sit here and talk about how can I design for the most vulnerable person in the world? How can I design for more than human life? I can only do that by listening, thinking, seeing, being able to spend time and learn from and with. But you have to be very careful, because I am very privileged, and if we're talking about for the people who are working in the refugee camps, you know, it's very, very tense to think about what we're actually providing versus what we're getting from learning from these communities. So it's really tricky. I mean, we've got various different kind of hubs. We've got the DASIS lab, which is a design for social responsibility that has been taking place around the world, and UAL is one of the hubs for that, which is looking at ways in which people from lots of different communities and lots of different places can be co-inquirers. So that idea of research, rather than researching somebody, it's like we're co-inquirers, we're learning from each other. But how do we create the conditions where it's fair for all of the people involved, where the risks, I mean, with the Shared Talent Project, I'm very careful. In fact, I suspended it because I realized that I was in such a position of privilege compared with the other people, and you think you can understand the risks that they are undertaking by spending time with you, but actually you can't necessarily do that, even a project that's a 3-year project. So I think we have to be really act with care and consider what we're best placed to do as creatives that can work together with others, and to break down this idea of different kinds of disciplines as well. So we're working on it. It's a work in progress. And as I said, I think the more that I work in this area, the more difficult it becomes, the more uncomfortable, the more I understand, just how difficult it is to be able to do this work. So I'm not sure that that's really an answer, but I think that being a greater awareness of just how difficult it is. It isn't just a simple thing of kind of creating better products or products that are using fair trade, et cetera, et cetera. a much deeper sense of changing ourselves, and that's something that I think we've all learnt within the centre that I work in, is that it has to start with a fundamental change in ourselves and how we reconsider our roles in the context of our times. And that is a massive shift. I mean, over the last 15 years, I don't think design and certainly design education was really kind of finding that difficult space and really working in it. But I think that is starting to happen.
I just want to add a couple of things on. You raised the very good point of the fashion that's being dumped in the pristine Atacama Desert. And we work with an organization called GAIO, which is the Ghanaian African Youth Organization. And so I'm painfully aware of the 15 million pieces of clothing that the UK send to one town in Ghana alone in the name of philanthropy. 15 million. Stuff that we don't want anymore, so we pop it in the charity bin or the charity shop, and this is where it ends up. 40% of it is burnt immediately because it's considered waste. So as you can imagine, we're just burning fossil fuels there, so the toxicity of that. And the only way that I see that this is going to change is through laws. So one of the things that we're very involved in is the UN Global Plastics Treaty, and also, which is a legally binding agreement that all 190 member states, including the big fossil fuel producing countries like Saudi and Russia and Iran, that have agreed that we need to have a global, legally binding treaty that will stop some of the things that we're talking about today, we hope. We have to have hope. It'll be in place by the end of next year, which is record time for any kind of global treaty. It will address the full life cycle of plastic. So when we talk about what happens to things once they have been made, who has responsibility for them, for its second, third, fourth, fifth, forever life, this whole concept of extended producer responsibility that you hear a lot about in industry now, this is what we need. It should no longer, I mean, people talk about packaging, and when I used to have a skincare brand, massive plastic sinner, by the way, I knew that I had to have product liability. Because if anything happened to somebody who used that product, or the end result of that product, we were liable for. Why is there not the same level of liability around packaging? It's all the same thing. We're making the same thing and sending it off with no regard for what happens to it next. So that whole thing of, if you as a manufacturer had to be responsible for the second, third, fourth, fifth, forever life of whatever it is you are pumping out, then you would think again, I believe, on using something as toxic and indestructible as plastic. And you would use materials that can safely go back to nature. So I have a little hope that some of these new regulations that are coming in, particularly through governments and through things like the Global Treaty, but we need, we're all powerful here. We all need to be squeaky wheels within our worlds of work, how we vote, all of these things, because it should not be down to the 1% of the world to decide how we're going to change the world, because it will never happen. The rich, the uber-educated, the uber-privileged will not change the systems of the world, because the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So it needs to come from the global south. It needs to come from an outrage and an optimism from the people.
Hi. Didn't know how to go there. Is this on? Can you hear me okay?
You were on.
Okay, cool. So I work in an innovation team for an apparel brand. I am in no means a fashionista. I went into it to try and make a change, and it gets very muddy very fast. I think it's amazing that you make like performance apparel, and one of ours is a big like hiking brand, and I'd love to hear more about like how you made that transformation from using Gore-Tex and lots of coatings, because the big argument is, oh, it needs to perform, and it's like, we could hike up naked, we'd be grand. And also I think that host for change is really interesting, and I've been hosting a lot of workshops internally, but I think that like, how would you recommend clarifying and enacting transformation with people who might have been in a company for 30 years, and you're coming in and you're like, hey, let's do this, and they're like, fuck off. So yeah, that would be great. Some advice.
Did I start?
Yeah.
Yeah, you start.
Yeah. No, actually, our journey has been very interesting in that sense that Mover was a technical ski clothing brand, formerly Swedish, which I took over almost 20 years ago. And I became specialized in technical ski clothing. I'm a fanatic skier, and I thought it was fun. But quite quickly, what we realized is that we were all doing the same garment. We're all building the same jacket and the same trousers for the same function. And there was no real reason to be for our brand on the market, which was already saturated. So our starting point was actually to try to differentiate us from the others. And then, of course, there was a natural feeding for natural fibers, for wool, for merino wool as a second layer. We were not first to the market. Icebreaker was already existing. And we started using that. And replacing the polyamide and the polyester, the dry fit from Nike we were using as first layers. Then we came to the insulation, which was polyester, Primaloft, Insulate, Thermolite, all these polyester waddings, insulation, fleece. They were giving too much heat. This morning I woke up sweating because I'm not used to sleep in polyester no more. I hate this feeling to wake up, and I think all around the world, including in the third world, they deserve to sleep in linen, in cotton, and in wool, which would make our lives much better to all of us. We developed, that was in 2009, the first wool insulation. I contacted Woolmark, and they came back to me 6 months after saying it was not existing. There was no wool insulation. Non-woven fleece was not made of wool, was not on the market. So we developed that with the German manufacturer. It was called Swiss wool first, now it's called Lavalan, and now it's spread around. There are UK suppliers and Italian suppliers, Chinese suppliers of wool, non-woven wool insulation. This is beautiful because it gives you a different thermal regulation. It gives you a different comfort. And that's what we were looking for, is this exchange. And then we were frustrated by the last shield, which was the Gore-Tex membrane. And we realized, because we had ski garments made with wool lining, wool wadding, first layers of merino, and we still had this plastic coating on the outside. And it is breathable in the lab, but it doesn't breathe in the mountain. When you walk up on a corridor, you have to take your Gore-Tex jacket off, else you come up at the peak and you are sweating. So we were not satisfied in terms of function. And we looked for an alternative on the market, which was actually existing here in UK since the 30s. It's the Ventile cotton fabric, developed for Burberry, for the British Army first, for the Navy, and then made the trench coats from Burberry's success. And we tried to use that for ski wear, and it worked like hell because we were breathing through the system. So the thermal regulation was way better and enhanced compared to the synthetic alternatives we have been developing before. So suddenly we realized we had something in the hands that actually had a better functional performance than what the industry was providing. And that's how to end the story and the loop, it's a sailor friend who came to me in Lausanne in 2015, who was with the foundation Race for Water, and they collected sand samples all around the world on the most remote beaches around the world. And the result of the analysis was disastrous in terms of plastic microparticles. And that's where we realized that we had already developed the solution to go plastic-free. And so it was really a process that comes from the performance and the function for our sport to a solution which is completely natural fabric-based. Try it in the mountain. It really works.
I will do.
And I'll just be super quick. I mean, I think being able to go through a methodology is something that I've developed around participatory practice, which if you can do something where you can suspend people's disbelief and take them somewhere, in nature preferably, or somewhere that is an environment where you can kind of convene people in a way that people can start to talk together. obviously through making is a really good way to do that, but not everybody is comfortable with doing something like that. But I've used the transformative scenario planning methodology, which is actually used in conflict resolution, which is basically kind of convening people, finding out what it is as their concerns, and it's the sort of U-shape, then you kind of get to the bottom of the intractability of the situation, and then you start to think about, imagine differently, and rather than taking a problem-solving approach. I mean, I tend to think that designers kind of get called problem solvers. Actually, we're possibility creators, because we don't start from the problem. We start from imagining envisioning how the world could look if we could think about what we all particularly want. And if you do that in a group, and then you collectively decide what it is that you actually would like to be doing and the place you'd like to be, and then you work backwards and do backcasting. Okay, so how do we work backwards to be able to do that, rather than working forwards where you kind of find yourself in a really tight spot. And then you kind of, you understand what you can do on a time scale, what you need to do now, what you commit to, and then, reconvene at different places and times. I mean, it's not easy, but it can be real fun, and you can be amazed at the difference it can make. And we've done that in really massive global businesses and sometimes you do also need somebody almost from outside to come in, because they can ask the sort of stupid questions as well. But yeah, that thing of immersion, convening people, really working out a visioning of where you'd want to be. And we also use scenario planning, where we actually show, based on data that we've gathered, different scenarios of what the world could look like in the future based on a kind of extrapolation. And scenarios planning is something that is used in all sorts of industries, where you go to the extreme of it could look like this or it could look like that, and you think, what would I do in those worlds? And then you can kind of work backwards as well. So there's a few different ways. They're all quite fun. So
I might find you after.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. I love what you just said about possibility creators, not problem solvers. That's exactly what we need right now. We work with business a lot, and I love saying to business people, imagine if you had just a white piece of paper, and you didn't have the baggage of your brand heritage and the stakeholders and everything that you drag into work every single day that restrict your thinking. You had a white piece of paper. What would a 21st century business look like today in whatever market you're in? And it is an extraordinarily freeing thing to give to people within the world of business, to think, well, I don't have to think about, I couldn't fail. That would be an amazing experience for me. So we need that level of imagination, don't we, of possibility creators, not problem solvers, is a great phrase that I'm going to leave everybody with. Thank you all for your wonderful questions, and thank you to my great panel. Thank you.